video number 16 in the Lessons in Logic series, and I believe our third video in categorical logic. And I think after this video, we can actually start looking at some methods of testing categorical propositions for validity to see whether the premises guarantee, let's say propositions, testing categorical arguments for validity to see if the premises guarantee the conclusion. But before doing that, we have to talk about this weird little issue in philosophy of language. I'm afraid there's no avoiding it, because if you have one perspective in response to this issue in philosophy of language, you'll use methods for testing categorical arguments for validity, and you'll use them in a particular way with a particular set of rules for applying that method. But if you take the other perspective on this weird little issue in philosophy of language, you use the same methods but with different rules. There'll be a few different procedures for applying the same methods of testing categorical arguments for validity. And I find the way this is often approached, and the way I've covered it myself in logic classes before, is a little confusing. We assume a normal perspective on this issue in philosophy of language, not even looking at the issue, just thinking in what I think is the normal way. And we look at some methods of testing categorical arguments for validity. Then we attack the issue in philosophy of language, and we have this jarring reconsideration of how we think about things. And we're told that this affects the methods we just learned, and maybe we were doing it wrong, or at least we have to learn a new way of doing it. But meanwhile, while we're learning a new way of doing it, we're rethinking this new, we're thinking through this new perspective, we're processing this new perspective in philosophy of language, and we don't have time to do those two things, which we have to do at the same time. And in the very next lesson, we jump ahead to some new issues, some new methods of testing arguments for validity, using our new perspective. But while we're still barely able to process this change in perspective in this philosophy of language issue, and don't have time to process how the methods we learned before we looked at the issue in philosophy of language were maybe done wrong, or maybe we need to learn a new way of doing them. Before we even have time to do all that properly, we're learning a new method. And while we're learning the new method, we might be wondering, wait, what if we had our old perspective on the philosophy of language issue? How would this new method work? Obviously, different textbooks might explain this more clearly or less clearly. If I remember correctly, Hurley's Concise Introduction to Logic, I thought, was much clearer on this issue than the other textbooks, but whatever. I'm going to make this as clear as I can here by doing it first. And then we will have both perspectives ready to hand when we need them as we look at methods in testing arguments for validity and categorical logic. And I'll just tell you which perspective we're using. And usually we'll use one perspective, but I'll tell you when we get to it I'll tell you how a method works using one perspective and how it works using the other perspective without doing so many different things at once and reconsidering things and jumping backwards and forwards. Let's just go forwards. Always forwards would be the right approach here. Okay, so, did I say I'll give you the methods of testing arguments for validity using both perspectives? I might not. Some methods I might just give you one perspective. But I think it would be less confusing if we have the issue in philosophy of language up front, and then we either look at a method according to both perspectives that you can take on this issue, or I just tell you which one perspective we're going to use, and we go with that. Anyway, the issue is whether universal propositions have existential import. So obviously I have to define existential import. Consider the claim all dogs are mammals and the claim all hobbits are mammals. Now, if I tell you all hobbits are mammals, and they are, I'm not implying that hobbits exist. But when I tell you all dogs are mammals, I actually am telling you all dogs exist, aren't I? Doesn't the use of a sentence like all dogs are mammals imply that dogs exist? Isn't that part of what it means? Isn't that part of what you're saying when you say all dogs are mammals? But it's not part of what you're saying when you say all hobbits are mammals. So there's a funny issue here. Does a sentence with the structure all X or Y imply that X actually exists? So a categorical proposition is a proposition relating to categories. And a categorical proposition is either affirmative or negative. It either takes one category and says it's within this other category, if it's affirmative, or if it's negative, it takes one category and says it's not in this other category. And it's either universal or particular, because it's either talking about everything in that first category or some things in that first category. So every categorical proposition can be stated in a standard form as can be stated in one of four standard forms, because it's either universal affirmative, universal negative, particular affirmative, or particular negative. And if it's universal affirmative, its standard form is all S or P. If it's universal negative, its standard form is no S or P. If it's particular affirmative, its standard is some S or P. Or if it's particular negative, its standard form, particular negative, its standard form is some S or not P. And those are the forms we call A, E, I, and O. So, for example, an A form proposition, all dogs are mammals. An O form, in order. An A form proposition, all dogs are mammals. An E form proposition, no sharks or pirates. An I form proposition, some pets are dogs. An O form proposition, some dogs are not pets. Every categorical proposition can be restated in one of those four standard forms. And for the two that are universal, the A and E, all S or P, no S or P, for example, all dogs are mammals, no sharks or pirates, the question of existential import is the question whether they're implying that the things in that first category exist. Should universal propositions be interpreted as implying that the things they talk about actually exist? That's the question of existential import. And existential import is what happens when a categorical proposition does imply that the things it's talking about exist. That first category it talks about, saying all these things are in this other category, or none of these things are in the other category, or some of them are, or some of them are not in the other category. Are we saying that those things exist or not? Existential import is what a categorical proposition has when it does say that, when it is implying that such a thing exists. All dogs are mammals has existential import if it's implying that some dogs exist. All hobbits are mammals does not have existential import if it's not implying that any hobbits exist. Some teacups are full of delicious tea has existential import if it's implying that teacups actually exist. So the question is, do universal propositions have existential import? They actually, both perspectives here, there are two perspectives to consider. Both perspectives agree that particular propositions have existential import. So some teacups are full of delicious tea, and some dogs are not pets. Both imply that the things they're talking about exist. They both have existential import. One of them implies that teacups exist, and the other implies that dogs exist. And everyone agrees on this. But there are two different positions on whether universal propositions have existential import. The older way, the traditional classical way, the Aristotelian approach, says that universal propositions have existential import. All dogs are mammals implies that dogs exist. The modern approach, sometimes called the Boolean approach, the modern perspective in this issue in philosophy of language that's relevant to categorical logic, is that universal propositions do not have existential import. They're not implying that anything in the class denoted by the subject term of the proposition exists. In other words, the modern perspective is that the sentence, all dogs are mammals, actually does not imply that dogs exist. What does it mean then? Well, here's a nifty chart. The A, E, I, and O form propositions, the A, E, I, and O forms of propositions are all S or P, no S or P, some S or P, and some S or not P. On the Aristotelian interpretation, they're all telling us that at least one S exists. All S or P means at least one S exists, and all S's are P's. The E form proposition is telling us at least one S exists and no S's or P's. The I form propositions is telling us that at least one S exists and is a P. The O form proposition is telling us at least one S exists and is not a P. And the Booleans agree on the I's and O's. So let's ignore those boxes on the chart now. Let's just talk about this. The modern Boolean interpretation of A and E form propositions is this. The A form proposition means if anything is an S, then it is a P. And the E form proposition means if anything is an S, then it's not a P. Or you can phrase it this way. The A form proposition means no S. There is nothing that is an S and not a P. And the E form proposition means there is nothing that is an S and is a P. In other words, let's work with examples here. All teacups are things designed to hold tea is an A form proposition. According to the Aristotelian, the proposition all teacups are things designed to hold tea means teacups exist and all of them are things designed to hold tea. But the modern approach is only The modern approach is that it means a little bit less. It only means if anything is a teacup, then it's a thing designed to hold tea. The modern approach to the claim, all teacups are things designed to hold tea, is that it means there is nothing that is a teacup. It is not designed to hold tea. But is there a teacup? That proposition itself doesn't tell you. Maybe there are, maybe you're thinking it when you talk about teacups, but the sentence itself is not telling you that. That's the modern approach. Let's do an E example. No. My brain just totally freezes here. It should be the simplest thing. No sharks or pirates. That'll work. No sharks or pirates. I don't need to look around the room. No sharks or pirates. According to the Aristotelian perspective, the traditional perspective, the sentence "no sharks or pirates" means some sharks exist and no sharks or pirates. But the modern perspective thinks that sentence is just telling us there is nothing that is a shark and is a pirate. Or if anything is a shark, then it's not a pirate. Is it telling us that sharks exist? No, it's not. Maybe sharks do exist. Maybe you think they exist. Maybe you're thinking that when you say no sharks or pirates, but your sentence itself does not imply that. Okay, so that is the basic overview of what existential import is and what are the two major perspectives on the subject, the Aristotelian and the modern perspective. Now, what's the philosophical issue, the issue in philosophy of language? The situation is this. In ordinary human speech, sentences with very different senses, very different meaning, very different implications, very different use, sometimes have identical grammatical structure. Let's say you're talking about pets, and you happen to say all dogs are mammals. Later, you're talking about Greek mythology. Let's not say Greek mythology. You're talking about Tolkien, and you say all hobbits are mammals. In the one case, you're talking about things that exist. In the other case, you're not. But both sentences have the same structure, all S or P. So since sentences with different meanings have the same grammatical form, a philosopher has to figure out which everyday use of a sentence is the more fundamental use of that grammatical form, all S or P. The Aristotelian philosophers think that sentences about things that do exist exemplify the basic sense of the grammatical form, all S or P. So Aristotelians have the very normal, everyday, sensible, common sense, I don't know how to describe this, the very normal, everyday approach to a sentence like all dogs are mammals and all hobbits are mammals, and they think that the basic sense of the structure of a proposition, all S or P, is the one captured by all dogs are mammals. Sentences about things that don't exist are the exception. They have a lesser sense than the basic sense. When you say all dogs are mammals, and you're thinking dogs exist, and you're implying that dogs exist, that's the use of your sentence in conversation. That's what the sentence actually means. That's what you're thinking when you say it. That's what people understand you to be thinking. That's the information you convey by that sentence. That's the normal way of using a sentence, like all X or Y, all S or P. But when you say all hobbits are mammals, you're doing something different. That's the Aristotelian view. The modern philosophers think, well, pretty much the opposite. Sentences about things that don't exist exemplify the basic sense of the grammatical form, all S or P. Sentences about things that do exist, or sentences where you're conversationally implying that something exists, or where the idea that something exists is in your head and you also manage to convey it to someone else with your sentence, those sentences are doing something extra. They're doing something in addition to the basic sense of the grammatical form, all S or P. So the moderns think that when you say all hobbits are mammals, you're capturing the basic sense of the grammatical form, all S or P, and that's that. And when you say all dogs are mammals, you're doing something extra. That is my best way of explaining what I think are the relevant perspectives in this particular philosophy of language issue. And the best thing I know to do with this is just to give you this chart and then move on swiftly, because frankly, this is not an issue worth spending a whole lot of time on in the study of logic, but it's one you can't avoid if you're going to do categorical logic properly. So this chart might help. Two sentences in everyday language, all dogs are mammals, or all hobbits are mammals. Since I'm using hobbits, let's fix the chart to say hobbits, because we like hobbits more than centaurs. All dogs are mammals and all hobbits are mammals are different sentences in everyday language. The Aristotelian thinks that all dogs are mammals is a literal sentence. And when you say all hobbits are mammals, you're actually not quite making a literal sentence. Or maybe we could say not literally minus a little something, but let's use whatever I just said. That sounded better, not quite literal. The Aristotelian understands the sentence, all hobbits are mammals, not quite literally. All hobbits are mammals, but none exist is the idea. Whereas the sentence, all dogs are mammals, literally means all dogs are mammals. Everything implied by the sentence, all dogs are mammals, that dogs exist and that they're all mammals, is conveyed by the sentence. Whereas the modern thinks that this idea that dogs exist and all of them are mammals is more than is conveyed by the sentence, whereas the generic the generic sense of the form all S or P only tells you, doesn't tell you that anything exists. And so the moderns think all hobbits are mammals is the literal sense of the sentence. And the sentence about dogs is literal plus something. I trust most of you can read the chart here. I think I've said what's on it. Let me just go over it in a slightly more orderly fashion, and maybe I can move on from this chart. Again, I don't want to spend more time on this than we have to. There are two different sentences in everyday language. All dogs are mammals, all hobbits are mammals. The Aristotelian thinks the sentence all dogs are mammals literally means all dogs are mammals, meaning dogs exist and they're mammals. Those two things are both the literal meaning of the sentence. But the sentence about hobbits, all hobbits are mammals even though none exist, is not quite literal. It's speaking less than the literal sentence does. But the modern thinks the sentence all hobbits are mammals is literal. It's not telling you anything about whether hobbits exist. And a sentence like all dogs are mammals, if it means those two things, all dogs are mammals and some exist, then that's the literal meaning plus something extra in the modern perspective. Because once again, the Aristotelians think universal propositions have existential import. The moderns don't. Now, why do we even care? Well, because it's an interesting issue in philosophy of language, because that's how things work in everyday language. So you're talking about pets, and you say all dogs are mammals. You're talking about Tolkien. You say all hobbits are mammals. Same grammatical form, different things are conveyed by these sentences. What's up with that? Well, here's what's up with that. An issue in philosophy of language, and here are two major perspectives on the subject, the Aristotelian and the modern. But why are we talking about this in a logic class? Because it affects how we apply our methods of testing arguments for validity. Because if the sentence, all dogs are mammals, really means all dogs are mammals and some exist, if that's its literal meaning, then that premise is telling you more than it is if the moderns are right. If the Aristotelians are right, a sentence like all dogs are mammals is telling you that dogs exist. But if the moderns are right, the sentence all dogs are mammals does not tell you that dogs exist. You need an extra sentence to tell you that in the modern perspective. So that affects how we test arguments for validity. The Aristotelian thinks a premise that's a universal premise says more than the modern thinks it says. So the modern will think you need an extra premise to get across that information that some dogs exist. And that's going to affect how we test arguments for validity. Sometimes an argument will look valid to an Aristotelian, but not valid to a modern unless you add an extra premise. Now, is there any reason to prefer the modern perspective? Why do most philosophers these days think the modern perspective is correct? Why do most logic textbooks tell you the modern perspective is correct? Well, here's something that might be a little clearer in the next video. But the modern perspective appears to have an important advantage because it can preserve the contradictory relationships among A and O propositions and E and I propositions. Now, we haven't talked about these contradictory relationships, but it should be fairly simple. All S are P contradicts with its corresponding some S are not P proposition, meaning if I say all teacups are things designed to hold tea, that contradicts the sentence, some teacups are not things designed to hold tea. All guinea pigs are fuzzy contradicts the sentence, some guinea pigs are not fuzzy. Similarly, E and I propositions contradict if they have the same terms. An E and I proposition would contradict if they're both talking about the same things. No sharks are pirates contradicts some sharks are pirates. No guinea pigs are bovines contradicts some guinea pigs are bovines. So A and O propositions and E&I propositions are respectively contradictory. The modern perspective has an easy time with this. The Aristotelian perspective seems to have some difficulty here. The proposition no Jedi are traitors and some Jedi are traitors should be contradictory because they're E and I propositions with the same terms. But on the Aristotelian perspective, they don't seem to conflict because no Jedi exists, so they're both false. If they're contradictory, one should be true and one should be false. That's what contradiction means. We'll probably talk about this in the next video. When we talk about contradiction, we don't just mean they can't both be true at the same time. We mean one has to be true and one false. But the proposition no Jedi are traitors and the proposition some Jedi are traitors are both false on the Aristotelian perspective because no Jedi exist. But no Jedi are traitors has existential import, implies that some exist. So it's false. Some Jedi are traitors implies that some Jedi exist, and that's false too. So it appears that the Aristotelian perspective has an advantage. Now, I think it's actually possible to maintain an Aristotelian position. I think if you scroll up and look at this chart here, you can say, no failure to contradict here because the E-form proposition is actually not claiming that some Jedi exist if you just don't read everything woodenly and literally as an Aristotelian. And of course, an Aristotelian will allow people to make sentences about centaurs and hobbits. So I don't think this is really that big a deal. This is one advantage of the modern perspective, that it can preserve these relationships while the Aristotelian perspective cannot. Or if you're an optimist about the Aristotelian perspective like me, you can at least say this is one apparent advantage, that it's easier to understand the contradictory relationship of A and O propositions and E and I propositions if you're modern, and the Aristotelian has to do a little extra careful thinking here. Perhaps I'm digressing here. This is one apparent advantage of the modern perspective, although I personally think the Aristotelian perspective can survive this possible objection to it. Now, what if you do agree with the Aristotelian view? I think most people do. I think this is the normal way of thinking. I think most people think that a sentence like all dogs are mammals totally implies that dogs exist. I think that's how the sentence is used conversationally. I think that's the information a person has in mind saying a sentence like that. And I think that's the information that is conveyed when someone else hears a sentence like that. I think if you have the Aristotelian view, you have a respectable enough philosophy of language. However, for a logic class that's not mine, you have to play along with the modern view. If you're taking a logic class and you're looking for tutorials here, you may have a respectable enough philosophy of language, but you may need to keep it to yourself. Or at any rate, you may need to, whether you keep it to yourself or not, play along with the modern view because your logic class will probably use the modern view for the most part. Logic textbooks these days normally use the modern view for the most part. As for me, if you were taking my logic class, well, play along with the modern view when you must, but you may not always have to. Let me see here. Some of these notes should possibly be revised. Logic textbooks. Let me just make this fit this series on lessons in logic because we haven't gotten to the traditional square of opposition yet. So let's not mention the TSO. What often happens in a logic class is we learn something called the traditional square of opposition, which is the Aristotelian perspective, and it's basically a nice training exercise in basic categorical logic. And we use the Aristotelian perspective for that, but then we move on to Venn diagrams and other methods that use the modern perspective. So play along with the modern view when you're doing Venn diagrams and everything else. Play along with the Aristotelian view when you're looking at the traditional square of opposition. But really, besides the advice to, as much as necessary, play along with the modern view if that's how your logic course is constructed, here's my other advice. If you agree with the Aristotelian view, it doesn't even matter for logic purposes. It matters to how you apply your methods of testing an argument for validity. But that just means if you work with the if you have the Aristotelian view, you just have to do a little bit of work up front to convert an argument into a standard form where your Aristotelian views will allow you to test it for validity using the modern perspective. And of course, moderns may occasionally have to put an argument into standard form in such a way that their modern perspective will allow them to use Aristotelian methods or something like that. I already said this, didn't I? So let me now restate what I said. The Aristotelian view is that a universal proposition implies that it's talking about things that exist. The modern view is that it does not, which means if you encounter a sentence like all teacups are things designed to hold tea, and you're modern, you don't think it's implying that teacups exist, but if you're an Aristotelian, you think it does imply that. And so if I say all teacups are things that are designed to hold tea, and therefore things that are designed to hold tea exist, that's a good argument according to the Aristotelian. The modern doesn't think so, unless you can make explicit the premise that some teacups exist, which means if you're an Aristotelian and you're using a modern method or a modern strategy of applying a method for testing an argument for validity, just take that extra premise and make it explicit. We've already talked about enthymemes, right? There's an earlier video on enthymemes. An enthymeme is an argument with an unstated premise or an unstated conclusion sometimes. If you're an Aristotelian, sometimes you just have to treat an argument as an enthymeme and take the statement that some things exist that the universal propositions are talking about and write it in, type it up, scribble it on your homework or whatever. Maybe if necessary, write in parentheses, previously unstated premise or some such, and you're good. Then you can apply your modern style of using methods to test arguments for validity, and everything's fine. So here's what does matter. None of this matters, strictly speaking, to whether premises of an argument guarantee the conclusion. It just matters to exactly how you apply your methods and what you do to put arguments into standard form sometimes. The only thing that matters is that we know the rules for using the methods we're using to test arguments for validity. Usually it's modern rules in textbooks these days. The old rules would be fine, but we would have to rewrite the textbooks, and I would have to reorganize, look at that. I would have to reorganize my own logic class or my own playlist, and I already have, so delete. That's why we're doing this video now. The old rules would be fine, but we would have to rewrite the textbooks. Once in a while, you might come across an argument that depends on the Aristotelian perspective and where we can reasonably assume that universal proposition is talking about things like things that exist. For example, all snakes are creepy reptiles, and therefore some snakes are creepy reptiles. And as I've already said, treat it as an enthymeme. Spell out that assumption in an extra premise, snakes exist. And then you could play along with the modern method with no trouble whatsoever. Now, this is no worse than the situation you might get once in a while if you use the Aristotelian perspective. If you're using the Aristotelian perspective and you come across an argument about centaurs or hobbits, you might have to observe that the premise guarantees the conclusion and then pause before moving on. Pause to point out that, of course, the premise is not true because there actually are no hobbits. All hobbits are hungry people, and therefore some hobbits are hungry people. It's a bad argument in Aristotelian logic. It's a good argument in Aristotelian logic in that the premises guarantee the conclusion, but it's a bad argument that the premises are false. Or you can't translate it into standard form the way you normally would, and you have to translate it as all hobbits would be mammals if any of them existed, but that would be confusing. And that particular confusion might be one other possible advantage of the modern view. I think it's easier for an Aristotelian to work with the modern view than vice versa, which is why, even though I personally suspect the Aristotelian view is actually correct, I really don't mind at all working with the modern view. Now, the whole point of our unit on categorical logic is to learn some methods of testing arguments for validity. These methods will be used one way for Aristotelians, another way for moderns. We could learn both ways in all of our methods. That would be too much to keep track of. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to use the Aristotelian approach for immediate inferences in the next video, and then we'll switch over to the modern approach to learn our other methods. And that's pretty much it. Questions? Put questions and comments on this video, I suppose. Some of you have questions. Anyway, thanks for watching.